Good morning. My name is Mark Cubit and I'm a member of the Chapter Committee of AIDN, the Australian International Development Network. AIDN's message is simple: more and better international development from Australia. One of the ways we're going about that is by showcasing and amplifying the work already going on in the sector. This is our second webinar for 2021 and it builds on last month's webinar celebrating International Women's Day. Those of you who listened then would well remember how Tara Winkler raised the issue of this white saviour narrative. Tara was proud to be doing what she was doing as a woman, but she was even more proud of the change Cambodian Children's Trust has implemented to embed its programs into the hands of the community. So I'm going to frame today's discussion in a quite straightforward fashion. If I want to fund someone to grow wheat, I go talk to a wheat grower in the Western District of Victoria. If I want to invest in a smartphone maker, I buy Apple shares on the US-based NASDAQ. But if I want to address poverty in Africa, I don't seem to call Nairobi or Kampala. I organise a Zoom call to New York or Sydney. Why is this so? Today we're going to talk about this issue, this problem, this dilemma. But we won't take all your time talking about the problem. Importantly, we will leave you with knowledge about the solutions from three acknowledged experts in the field. Before we jump right in, on behalf of everybody involved from wherever you are tuning in and joining us, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we are all meeting on and pay our respects to them and leaders past, present, and emerging. We also take the opportunity to thank them for the continued care of our land, sea, and community. Today, we'll have both chat and Q&A functions operating and time for Q&A before the end of our 60 minutes. Now to the three acknowledged experts joining me in the conversation today. For detail on their background, you can read their bios on the invitation sent to you. But briefly, Katie Bunten-Wamaru has lived in Africa for 8 years and been involved with funding of hundreds, yes, hundreds of local NGOs. Evelyn Omala is Ugandan, also has overseen grant making to hundreds of partners, and prior to that has walked the streets of Kampala and Washington, DC, working for an NGO addressing HIV/AIDS. Peter Yao was brought up in Southeast Asia and has been key in ThankyouAUS' journey from funding the largest NGOs to today also funding some of the smallest. So, without further ado, let's dive straight in. Katie, you get the first question. Frame the problem for us. What is the issue here?
Thanks, Mark. And I'm really excited to be on this call. This is kind of a new network for me. I'm calling in from the Eastern United States, so it's a little late, but I'm really excited that this group is talking about this issue. And I think really what I think about in terms of framing the issue is that there's this kind of historic underfunding of local leaders around the world, particularly in the global South. And there's really a plethora of data, and it all kind of consistently shows this huge gap in funding. So 0.4% of all international funding goes to locally led organizations around the world. If you just look at US foundation giving to the African continent, less than 5% goes to African-led organizations. The Echoing Green, one of the leading social innovation fellowships, found that African-led innovators organizations applying to their fellowship received 90% less funding when they applied on average from other funders than their white-led peers. And within the Siegel Family Foundation portfolio of hundreds of organizations, which even I both worked with, African-led organizations grew their revenues half as fast. So there's this really large funding inequity, and there's multiple overlapping barriers that kind of allow this inequity to persist. And sometimes it's proximity to funder networks, bias, definitions of risk that don't take into consideration lived experience and community buy-in. And I think when we zoom out and hear these data points, the funding gap can sound really alarming and like it's a very huge gap and problem, and it is. especially when we know that local leaders actually have an easier pathway to impact. They have more community buy-in, they can navigate different cultural contexts, the context they're from, and understand easier. They can manage evolving contexts like we saw in 2020 easier. And so I think it's important to also see that although this is a really large and alarming problem and gap, it's also a huge opportunity. And we don't even know what's possible if we were to resource local leaders commensurate to their potential, the kind of innovation that could unlock, the kind of social change. And so I think it's a big issue that I'm really excited this group of funders is digging into. And we can also see it as a really huge opportunity to unlock transformation.
Thanks, Katie. Eve, do you agree with Katie?
Yeah, totally. And of course, being from Africa, being from some of these communities, these are things I have actually witnessed firsthand, that many of the local organizations that I've known growing up really struggle to scale, they really struggle to grow because they can't attract any funding. And one of the things that we hear a lot is that, funders cite corruption, they cite embezzlement, and these are some of the fears that they've got in investing in a locally led African organization. But interestingly, many funders who hold these perceptions actually have never funded locally led organizations. And what we see on ground is very different from this narrative. We see, and we have a history of organizations that are very trusted, they deliver, they have proven themselves, and they have created significant impact in their communities. They are trustworthy, they are transparent, and they have set up systems to mitigate some of these risks. So you have to know how to identify the right organizations, and you have to know exactly what you're looking for, have a thorough due diligence process. But I can speak confidently that there are many organizations out there, African-led, that can be trusted and are very transparent in how they're operating.
So Katie, you founded the African Visionary Fund about I'm going to say about 6 months or so ago now. Tell us, maybe longer, tell us how are you addressing the issue?
Yeah, so we really got started almost exactly a year ago, which is pretty wild to think about the time that we were kind of getting the fund off the ground. And the African Visionary Fund was really seeded by a group of foundations who wanted to address this funding inequity head on. And I think it was a group of foundations who wanted to pool funds and kind of create this bridge fund that could help really get money moving when there were funders who kind of were really bought into the why and understood why we should be shifting more funding to local leaders, but maybe didn't know how to get started on the how. And so our whole model has really centered on driving funding to African visionaries. We envision a world where African-led organizations have the resources they need to accelerate their impact, and where funders recognize them as critical drivers of systems change on the continent. So our model is really to find, fund, and amplify stellar African visionaries. We know that one of the biggest gaps for African leaders is flexible, patient capital that is required to nurture innovation and growth. So we provide multi-year unrestricted funding, and typically do so at a level that matches their kind of top funder or highest grant amount. So we're really trying to shift meaningful amounts of money that will address this large funding gap they face. And alongside that, we provide high touch, on the ground capacity support through their triumphs and their challenges. We amplify the success of their work and try to spread the word, connect them to funders, help solve that proximity to funder networks challenge, and also work alongside their team to invest in and support their organizational development goals. And to build on what Eve was saying, I think there's a perception that locally led organizations might have inherently less capacity, but capacity often costs money. And so if organizations are chronically underfunded, we can't kind of hold this rubric to them that they should have some sort of capacity that would cost them a lot of money to hire or build without funding that. So we both fund their core activities, their core work through unrestricted funding, and also provide additional support and funding for capacity support. And then I think one of the things that we were able to do in 2020 because of I mean, because of the multitude of factors over the course of the year that made it a really different year to get a new thing off the ground, we really could reimagine what a grant maker could look like that was really centered on equity, so that our funding model and the how of our funding matters as much as the funding itself. So from the beginning, we had a founding working group that was majority African and majority social entrepreneur, who really informed every piece of our model, from our core values to our governance structure, our grant making criteria, in our co-leadership model. We recently brought on our co-CEO, Ati Worku, who's based in Ethiopia and who's an African visionary founder herself. She has lived the journey of an African-led organization that she started and ran for 10 years and has a really deep knowledge of what our partners face, the challenges they face, and the support they need. And so our hope is to have kind of develop a model for shifting millions of dollars in flexible patient capital to African innovators, and do so in a way that also shifts power over what our funding looks like, and really that we ourselves are an African governed institution, as well as shifting funding to African-led organizations.
Katie, can you mentioned your leadership, and I think you including your board there has African participation in it. Can you just run me through roughly the makeup of your selection panel, your board, your staffing?
Yeah, we are a small but mighty team right now, a year into the fund getting off the ground. So our team is myself and our co-CEO, Ati. We also have a communications officer who is Kenyan and based in Nairobi, named Waringa Kamau. And our board, we have 4 board members, one of whom is on this call right now. Shout out to Evelyn Omala, who is also on our founding working group. And our board of 4 members, 3 are African and 2 of them are social innovators themselves. And then we have 1 funder representation on the board as well.
Okay, and we might talk about some of those partners later on, but you've just had your round of initial grants. How many grants? How much? How many years? You'd mentioned the funding's untied.
Yeah, so we made our first round of grants in January. We did $1 million in multi-year unrestricted funding grant commitments to 6 partners. So each partner got a commitment of $180,000 over 3 years, $60K a year. Of those 6 partners, they're from 5 different countries, 4 of which are in East Africa, 1 in Southern Africa, and a real broad spread across sectors, including education, health, livelihoods, and human rights.
Okay, and how is a prospect looking for future funding for AVF?
Future funding for the fund. I mean, I think that we have a goal of raising $10 million by 2023 for this first fund. We are over a third of the way there. We're right at about 3.5 million in 100% unrestricted, 90% multi-year funding, which is what we require in order to be able to do multi-year unrestricted funding to our partners. And I think we have come up at a time where a lot of funders are feeling a kind of both a pressure and a commitment to shifting money differently and shifting funding to local leaders, and looking for avenues to do that in geographic regions where they might not be as familiar or have as many networks or context. And we can really solve a lot of problems for funders. And so I think we're hopeful that that will continue to result in being able to shift more and more money directly to African leaders.
Katie, has there been a shift in interest in your model given the events of the summer of last year in the US? I must admit, I probably saw the Black Lives Matter movement as something that was happening, well, based on a few tragedies and happening on the streets last summer. You move into your fall, autumn and winter, and that was that. But I'm recognizing as I talk to people as we get into this year that no, it feels to me like there's been a fundamental shift in the way people in your country are thinking about these matters. Can you just talk about that for a moment? Yeah,
I think there's been some pretty major shifts in 2020. And I think it's almost like the starting line got moved of the conversation around this funding inequity. Because when I was based in East Africa, like you mentioned, for a long time, and we were kind of working on this idea with a set of African leaders I was working with through the African Visionary Fellowship at Cubit Family Foundation. And we started to kind of workshop this idea of the fund, and I talked to funders about it. And there was a lot of interest, but there was also some trepidation, or just some not quite a full understanding of the why behind the fund. And a year ago, when we were just getting it off the ground, it was early April 2020, and the first kind of major lockdown was happening in Boston, where I was based. And I definitely had a moment of, this was probably a really bad choice. What am I doing? Starting something new in the midst of a global pandemic, unlike that we've seen in generations. And I think that actually the events of 2020 kind of underscored the need for this work and the need to address this funding inequity incredibly effectively, in a way that we have now shifted out of a conversation about the why in many places and into a conversation about the how. And I think that there's a kind of unquestionable acknowledgement that it is important to resource locally led organizations around the world, because when a global crisis like COVID happens, they're the ones left holding the bag. They're the ones in communities who pivoted the fastest, who cared for and protected their communities throughout a year of ups and downs and in and out of lockdowns. And then with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and kind of a new level of understanding, particularly amongst white American communities, I think that, again, we kind of had a step change in the conversation of, we're no longer kind of okay with not talking about this and not addressing it. And we might not know how, and we might fumble, and we might, really struggle to figure out how to move from that new awareness into action. But we kind of can't go back to the state of not acknowledging that race has a part to play in this funding inequity, and then of course in many other issues around the world.
Okay, so Katie, you've told us how you choose who to fund, but how do you find the candidates to go on your selection list in the first place? This has got to be a challenge for anyone, for me sitting here in Melbourne, anyone sitting here in Australia. Okay, this is great. How do I find these people? How do you find them?
Yeah, so we have a network of referral partners. That's kind of what we built straight off the bat, using the networks of our founding working group, our kind of networks on our board as well, to look for incubators, accelerators, fellowships, programs that work with really early stage African-led nonprofits and social enterprises. And that referral network, especially in 2020, we really wanted to get money moving quickly. There was a huge urgency in the need for communities across the African continent, and a need to get money to African-led groups. And so we leaned into that referral network because it gave us a head start. It allowed us to build on existing relationships and diligence and kind of move through a selection process faster. Moving forward, and something that our new co-CEO Ati is really looking forward to working on, is how do we open up our pipeline and open up more inclusive ways to get into the fund, open application systems, peer nomination systems, and just removing barriers to entry. I apologize for my dogs crashing the webinar right now. 2020 is nothing but work and life merging. And so that referral network is really how we leaned in last year. And then our founding working group is really the group that came up with our initial grant making criteria, which is how we kind of take a huge list and narrow it down. And I think something we really learned, I'm sure Eve can relate to being part of these decisions, is that we don't have a pipeline problem. We have no problem finding incredibly impactful, effective African-led organizations that can take in a lot more capital. I think from that first round, it was like, if we had another $1 million to give out, we could have easily done that. And we really looked at, in those criteria, our founding working group talked about the fact that there's kind of a funding desert for African leaders after the kind of startup phase or the early phase of their organizational development, where they actually know what they want to do, they know how they want to grow it, they know that it's impactful, and there's this gap where the funding completely dries up. They're getting kind of too large of an organization for small grants programs and grassroots grants programs, but they're not large enough for the next stage of funding. And so we really honed in on our criteria to focus in on what are the factors an organization needs to have in place to make it through that desert, and then what can we provide alongside that to help them through. And so we've kind of used those grant making criteria and that referral network to find the initial 6 organizations we brought in out of 70 total referrals to begin with. And we've gotten another roughly 100 referrals since then, as we look to do another 1 to 2 rounds of grant funding later this year. So pipeline is definitely not a problem.
So if you've got another 100 referrals on top of the other 70 referrals, anyone here in Australia who's struggling to work out how to do this, maybe they should contact you about becoming a supporter of AVF. There's a plug, okay?
Great, thanks, Mark.
Great. And before I move on to Eve, it's important we identify everyone on the call. So Katie, the name of your dog.
There are 2, Mindy and Rocky, and they're a mother-son pair that originally hail from Nairobi.
Fantastic, thank you. Eve, so tell us about your grassroots portfolio work that you've been doing for Planet Wheeler Foundation, for Cubit Family Foundation, and for Partners for Equity.
Yeah, I'm happy to share more details about that portfolio. So in 2018, I think it was, while attending a conference in Africa, which the folks at Planet Wheeler attended at Cubit Family Foundation and Partners for Equity, a statement was made there that came from The Guardian. And it said, less than 2% of all international aid money globally goes to local organizations. Wow. So that statistic was quite shocking for most people that were in that room, and especially the folks at Partners for Equity, Planet Wheeler, and Cubit Family Foundation. Of course, this huge funding gap was unbelievable, but also an eye-opener. Up to this point, all those funders had actually supported African organizations in one way or the other. They had interacted with several terrific African organizations through these conferences and different types of platforms. And from funding a few, they all knew that these organizations were actually very impactful. And, quite frankly, you get more value for your money when you fund locally led organizations. So here in this, the next natural thing to do was to have an intentional strategy around how to support locally led organizations. And that's when I came on board. So in 2009, we put together a portfolio, and it currently has got 11 organizations, all African led. And all these organizations have demonstrated impact. They've got lots of ambition to grow and scale their work. But of course, the most obvious thing is that they lack funding to accelerate their work. So we've given grants to all 11 of these organizations, and they work in different sectors such as healthcare, education, and women empowerment. And within just 1 year of funding, the first year of funding, we actually saw a significant increase in the number of beneficiaries that they were reaching. Some, grew their numbers by, almost 3 times as fast as we'd even imagined. And later on, I'm going to share more concrete examples of the impact that we've seen when I talk about individual organizations. But the one thing that we've, of course, come to recognize, and Katie touched on this a bit, is that to be able to support these organizations to accelerate their impact, you need to invest in their capacity. You need to have a component of capacity support. And that is a big component of what we're doing right now with the grassroots portfolio. So we're helping these organizations to grow. We are mentoring them. We've given them small grants to help them set up systems and structures, invest in the right financial systems. And as a result, we're seeing improvements in their reporting, overall communications, and many of them, actually all of them, have put in place reasonable processes and policies to reduce the risk of financial mismanagement. The other thing that we do a lot of is that we work very closely with these groups. We get updates on their work. Before the lockdown, actually, I was traveling anywhere between 3 to 4 times back to Africa to see these organizations, to see their work in action. And we have quarterly calls with them. And, this hands-on approach helps create trust. It helps create openness and transparency, and generally strengthens the relationship that we have with these organizations, which is what you really want to have if you've got a group of, even if it's not locally led partners, like anyone funding, I think you should aim to have a strong relationship with the organizations that you fund.
Thank you, Eve. And Eve, if Australians want to support any of those organisations, are they able to?
Definitely. So all these organizations have been vetted, and they're part of the Partners for Equity Network, which means that you can actually give money through that channel that goes directly to those organizations 100%. So if anyone wants to support any of these organizations, we can share all their profiles with you, and all your money will be tax deductible. You can pass it through Partners for Equity.
Right. Okay, great. So Eve, tell me about the challenges you face when you're dealing with some of these partners. I guess perhaps we might compare it with an offshore-based organisation that has a pretty classy communications division, some great writers on the team, and so forth. What are the specific challenges that you're clearly happy to persevere with or to work on in the name of greater efficiency?
Yeah, so oftentimes with these organizations, again, because they've got a history of, they've just found it very hard to raise funding to grow, you find that they're stretched too thin. Again, they can't raise funding fast enough to grow their teams. So many times it's not rare to find that the executive director, who also doubles as the founder, is the person that writes the reports, is the person dealing with the monitoring and evaluation, is the person doing literally everything, because they don't have the funding to grow fast enough. So with this, you find that their reports might not be up to the quality that you want them to be, but you know that with more funding, if they're able to hire the right staff, then they'll be able to get that. Whereas somebody from a foreign-led organization, a Western organization, many times they'll even have volunteers from universities that can be able to fill in some of these gaps. They have access to all kinds of resources that we don't have back in Africa. And with more money, we are able to actually access those resources. So that's one of the gaps that we've been finding, that with a little bit of capacity building, and even resourcing them to, have access to some of these networks, they've been able to improve some of these things. So for example, with the grassroots portfolio, we actually have a consultant. We have 2 consultants, marketing and communications consultants, that have come on board, who work very closely with these organizations to help them tell their story, demonstrate their impact, change the way they communicate about their work. And we've seen lots of improvements with that kind of investment. And yeah, so the fact that they're stretched too thin, they're very early stage nature, of course, just comes with a lot of capacity gaps that you've got to help them close. But the other big challenge that I see with the partners that I work with is that a number of them are still getting restricted funding, which doesn't give them any breathing room to be able to cover their core expenses. And you find that, the nature of the communities that they're in means that sometimes you need to react instinctively to the needs that develop in front of you. And COVID-19 was a good example, that showed how fast organizations need to act, how flexible they need to be. But then if funding is restricted, then you find that they can't address some of these needs that show up from time to time. And that is why the approach we've taken with the grassroots portfolio is to give them untied funding, because we know how responsive you have to be when needs emerge. Cholera could happen anytime, Ebola happened, and it's the organizations that had flexible funding that were able to go in and respond at a much faster pace.
Eve, I'm just going to bring in a question from the chat function here, and if anyone wants to put in a question, feel free on the Q&A chat function there. I think you've covered it off largely, but that's from David Martin. I'm interested in your thoughts around the responsiveness of local organisations versus foreign-led organisations when it came to COVID-19 and moving resources and expertise to communities that sorely needed it. So you're saying that provided they had untied funding, they were able to be much more responsive?
Definitely. And yeah, that's a very interesting question, because we saw a lot. It just exposed a lot of what local organizations can do and what foreign-led organizations are not able to do because of a lack of understanding of the context, but also, of course, local organizations had more buy-in. Now, with the COVID-19 situation, what happened in many of the communities that we serve, actually, we saw a number of foreign-led organizations packing up, getting onto planes and heading back to their countries. Not all of them did that, a few stayed, but even for the ones that stayed, they were not able to move resources as fast as locally led organizations were able to. These local organizations are from those communities. They know the channels to where you can channel money very quickly. They have relationships with the local leaders, with the people in those communities. And we saw that they were able to quickly move resources and reach people, train people. But also a lot of what we saw with COVID was having to translate materials very quickly into local languages and all of that. Now, foreign-led organizations, especially many who have got expert-led teams, were not able to act as fast with that in that regard. But we saw local organizations coming up very quickly, create posters, go out there, talk to people in local languages, spread the message. And, you know, we started to see things start to change in those communities, hand washing happening, people relating to exactly what was happening. And of course, you know, in most of Africa, COVID was looked at as the white man's disease. And in some communities, it was actually not even as welcome to see a foreigner talking about COVID, because then people quickly said, but this is your disease, why are you coming to our community? Which was bad, but then it just highlighted that, you know, a local intervention was just the way you could penetrate the community.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, a question for both of you. Eve, I'll give you, you're on a roll, I'll give you the chance to answer first. We fund some great organisations like Muso, Last Mile Health. I'm the board chair of the School of St. Jude, all organisations founded by people from outside the country. Let's discuss these NGOs not run by local leaders for a moment. What is it that they might get wrong?
Yeah, so of course, we don't want to criticize foreign-led organizations. We've seen very many that are led by passionate leaders and are doing a terrific job. But one of the things that we tend to see that they tend to get wrong is coming in with a top-down approach. Sometimes, you know, we've seen foreign-led organizations come into our communities, and just by looking around, they think they know what the problem is. They go on to design an intervention without including the community, without including local voices. And what happens in that situation is that you see an intervention that is mismatched from the community needs. And eventually, of course, it won't work out. And I can give you an example because I really love this example. So a foreign organization came into X community in Africa. And when they looked around, they saw women walking for about 2 kilometers going to fetch water at a well. And to them, the issue was that, oh, you know what? They don't have the water close to their community. So they've got to walk lots of kilometers to go fetch water. So their intervention was, you know, let's set up boreholes in the community so that the women can, you know, just walk 2 minutes, 5 minutes to access different water points. And they did invest a lot of money in setting up all these boreholes in the communities. But guess what? After the boreholes were set up, the women continued to walk to the well. And so they come back and say, no, something is wrong here. Maybe we did not train them on how to use the boreholes. They trained the women, they trained the chiefs. They did everything that they could do to get women to get water from the boreholes. And the women said no. Then eventually they engaged the community. Okay, what is wrong? What is going on here? Why won't you use the boreholes? And the women told them, because when we walk to the well, it is a long journey, but that's when we get to bond. That's when we get away from our husbands. That's our time. And we love the whole, you know, the journey, the adventure. If they had talked to the community in the very first place, they would never have made such a mistake. And I would say that that was a wasted investment because the boreholes all went to waste. So I think sometimes foreign-led organizations fail in fully integrating local organizations and getting their input on how things should work. The other thing I see that they tend to get wrong sometimes is having an all-foreign board and senior leadership team with no locals, no local voices informing decision-making. And if you choose to go down this route, I think it's a recipe for disaster and you're just setting yourself up to fail. You won't get buy-in from the community and people will just work to fail you. So I encourage foreign-led organizations to do some stock taking of their organizations. Where does the power truly lie? Examine yourself. Are locals part of the decision making? Do their views and perspectives really matter? Are they represented on the board? Are they represented in senior leadership? And even when we go to the fact on compensation, you find that again, for many of them that have managed to bring in as many locals to inform decision making, the compensation structure is completely wrong. You'll find a foreigner and a local doing the exact same job, but the foreigner is getting paid twice as much as the local employee. That is going to demotivate their entire team. They're going to fail your organization. So you have to look at all the structures and make sure that there is fairness, there is equity, and that you're doing the right thing. Yeah, I'll take a pause at that point.
Katie, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I also try to, I think it's hard to talk about all foreign-led organizations. I agree with a lot of Eve's points about kind of the classic mistakes. I also think that we're seeing more kind of, I think broadly in the development sector, a lot more talk about systems change and how do we get at the root causes of some of these issues and kind of move away from only addressing symptoms. And in my experience, African-led organizations are more focused on systems change earlier and more effectively, particularly when it comes to government engagement. And it's because they often understand how local governments work a lot better than foreign-led organizations. So a great example in our portfolio is an organization in Kenya who started as a holistic place-based community organization focused on public health, and have actually created systems change in the way the local government across entire counties is addressing gender-based violence survivors, and has removed all fees for those survivors when they come to file a report at the police or are seen at a hospital. And those fees are often a huge barrier to gender-based violence survivors actually reporting the violence. They've been able to do that in an entirely community-led bottom-up way. So it's much more sustainable. I think that a lot of African governments and local governments feel a sort of resentment when a foreign-led organization comes in and they feel like they're being told what they should be doing, or they should do it this way, versus something that comes really organically from a community and from community advocacy. It's much more likely to kind of stay and be a systems change that embeds into existing systems in the long term. So I think when we think like 20 years from now, I would imagine that we're at a place where if the step change in 2020 was we can now fully acknowledge that locally led organizations are incredibly important and we need to better resource them. I would hope that in 20 years, we've acknowledged that locally led organizations are actually the most effective way to impact long-term change in communities, and that we're just rethinking how foreign-led organizations can amplify that work and be kind of allies and co-conspirators to work that's really bottoms up, instead of kind of this outside-in, top-down development that I think is really going to become a relic of the past.
Right. Okay, thanks, Katie. Eve, one of the NGOs that Amanda and I funded was run by a local leader, and it didn't end well. With our money, the buildings were built, considerable services were provided to the local community. So we saw that with our own eyes. But we found out the land title was in the name of the founder, not the NGO. There was spending unaccounted for, and there are evasive answers to all of our questions about such issues. At the end of the day, it was an issue of trust. What's your response to that?
Oh, I don't like the story. But I'll start by asking you, Mark. So, of course, I know you funded foreign-led organizations as well as locally-led organizations. And I wanted to find out, so how many foreign-led organizations have you stopped funding for one reason or the other?
Probably 120.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how many locally led organizations have you stopped funding?
A lot less than that. Yes.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That's very good. That's not bad for everybody.
Therein lies the answer. But to be fair, we have not funded nearly as many locally led organisations. So, which is somewhere where we have to considerably improve what we're doing as well. Yes, your point is very valid. We focus on issues like this and ignore all the many other reasons why we stop funding groups, which One of the main reasons is perhaps the decision that that program is just not as effective as what we'd anticipated.
Right, and there's obviously risk, and not all relationships and partnerships will work out. But then there are so many success stories that underweigh these risks. And I would say that, you know, sometimes trust relationships will be broken, and we just have to be careful. And, you know, when we work very closely with these organizations, you start to identify some of these signs. You can start to see when things are not heading in the right direction. And that is why we say a very close collaboration with these organizations, because if you know somebody very well, the danger signs are right in your face. If you're doing capacity building and you've got a program that helps them build their capacity, then that capacity support can help mitigate some of these risks before it comes to that. So for example, again, with the grassroots portfolio, the first step that we took, one of the first steps that we took was helping them get QuickBooks, transition to QuickBooks. And once you do that, you know that you're going to have transparency, you know, and visibility into how they're managing their financials, you know, that they have proper systems in place. And if they don't have those and you feel that, you know, these are going to be danger signs, then help them get there. It's really a journey and we have to support them on this journey. But again, even sometimes with very solid investments into capacity support, things just don't end up the way, you know, they will. You always have that one naughty child, you know, amongst all your kids. And I think this was your naughty child, but I will say confidently that we have way more success stories from locally led organizations than we do failures.
I've just noted naughty child. Thank you, Eve. Hey, Pete Yao, he's here from Thank You. Not just here for his good looks, but also, Pete, I seem to recall you started out by funding some of the largest and well-established INGOs, and now here you are as one of the first funders of an initiative targeting some of the smallest local NGOs. Thank You is one of the earliest funders of AVF. Can you talk about your funding journey as a corporate funder?
Yeah, I think fortunately 12 years ago when we started, we had a really great understanding on the impact and sort of sustainability type mechanisms or even modalities that funders and grantees can have together. So there was no one-for-one, you know, there was no, hey, thank yous in it just for the outputs or the really glamorous type aid on development interventions. However, what we still had to cater for as a corporate funder was our donors who were actually our consumers. And as you know, 5-year-old to a 55-year-old would buy into what we do. And the understanding of development is actually rooted in a lot of, we'll say, negative bias on supporting local leaders, everything that Eve and Katie and yourself has discussed over the last few minutes. And so for us, we went straight to the big INGOs because that's who the 5 or the 55-year-old would actually trust and know. So it's brand reputation. And a lot of it was risk mitigation as well. And once again, not to throw the big INGOs under the bus, but what we did sort of not see, and this is to both Eve and Katie's point, was the sustainability and the scale of different interventions, which was they're great at rolling out a particular program, great at rolling it out really quickly, great at deploying large sums of money. But when it came down to, okay, what's the true impact? What actually happened? Did we treat root causes or was it just symptoms? You know, how was the local community actually engaged? We started asking ourselves questions. And I think last year, as the pandemic taught us, it really had a significant impact on our business. We grew somewhat over 500 to 600% in terms of our giving. So before that, we had given about 7 million in the last 11 years. The last round of funding, we gave 10 million. And so for us, it was the mirror moment and just to look at ourselves and going, do we still cater for this old way of thinking or this approach of let's consider the trust story that our donors have and let's constrict our grantees because of that risk? Or do we actually take a chance? You know, do we actually advocate? Do we actually educate our consumers on why that way of thinking can sometimes be really problematic? And in so doing, we found organizations like AVF and organizations that support local entrepreneurships. And we're not perfect by any means. We're still on this learning journey, but that explains a bit about our little journey.
Okay. And then I think you really went public with that journey when Thank You wrote that incredibly insightful piece, the annual letter. Perhaps it was about 6 months ago, titled "The Giving System's Broken, We Helped Break It." In that letter, you referred to the roadblocks faced by NGOs, and I want to refer back to that issue of trust. I think you mentioned it a moment ago. It was raised earlier. It really can be seen as the elephant in the room. You quote the Open Road Alliance Roadblock Analysis Report in your letter, and that puts partner problems and fraud theft at 9 and 14% respectively of all the funding problems faced by NGOs. And I really should say only 9 and 4%, because there were far bigger issues that were raised in that report as causing roadblocks to NGOs' growth. Can you expand on that? Was that report insightful to yourselves?
Yeah, I think it confirmed a lot of our anecdotal evidence that we collected across multiple years of grantee relationships and feedback that they've given us. But the report actually showed that the majority of the obstacles that each grantee faced was not, theft or government corruptions or even acts of God. It was funders and funder-led obstacles, which amounted to something like 40-something%, which was staggering. And that mirror moment actually really hit us. And I think, just a mirror moment and reflection with our two other co-founders and grant managers, Daniel and Justine. We sat together as a charitable trust board and team and said, hey, we've probably contributed to that statistic. And to give you an example, as we're talking about consumers and engaging them in this trust exercise. So not only did we fund INGOs, but we required something called Track Your Impact, which is this actually output-based reporting system, which connected an individual thank you product to a well, for example, or another output that they were supporting. And it's got a lot of buzz, won a lot of awards. Funnily enough, it was only Western awards, if that makes sense. So a lot of great tech awards or a lot of great business awards, no awards from the grantees themselves. In fact, one of the anecdotes that we got from them was, we require more reporting than DFAT. And then we would high five after that. We would be like, that's awesome. You know, we're actually keeping our grantees accountable. But that mirror moment of reading the report, we're actually just thinking to ourselves, if we're to expand from not just 10 million to 20 million and hopefully keep annually exponentially, do we want to be that funder that really takes up all of our grantees' time? Also, we would eliminate a lot of grantees that aren't set up for this Track Your Impact system, you know, and usually it's the smaller locally organizations that we would eliminate. And we actually make this, we think this risky move of shutting Track Your Impact down and becoming unrestricted trust-based philanthropic givers, because at the end of the day, our North Star is supporting our partners. That's our number one reason. You know, it's not to actually, you know, be a risk manager for our brand, so to speak. And I know that may ruffle feathers, but it's what we're in this for. It's what we're in this as philanthropists for. And so we made that step and we're going to wear the risk. But I think, sorry, to finish off, I think the bigger risk is being a giver that actually restricts, constraints, only treats symptoms and constantly perpetuates this development cycle. And that's the bigger risk that I think we have to grapple with.
Great, thank you, Pete. So, so we've addressed the issues. We've told you can invest in these groups through the likes of African Visionaries Fund or Partners for Equity. Katie and Eve, can you give us one example each of a group that you're currently funding? We'll start with you, Katie.
Sure. Yeah, I'll talk about the group that I kind of mentioned in passing before. They're called Dandelion Africa in Kenya, and they are a really community-owned, community-embedded organization that really everything about their model centers on gender equity and the barriers to gender equity, economic, health, education. Between 2019 and 2020, they reached 82,000 people with primary health care through their mobile outreaches. 10 villages where they have done extensive work have been declared FGM free. And then they've done this incredible bottoms-up systems change in partnership with local governments and a variety of actors around gender-based violence that I think they're just creating really incredible, deep-rooted change in those communities that is gonna last many years to come. So I would promote Dandelion Africa, and lots more information is available on them on their website and our website.
Great. And Eve?
I'll talk about Rays of Hope. They are in Malawi. They're founded by a guy called Willie, who he got his master's degree in the US. He could have stayed in the US, been employed by a big organization there, but he chose to move back to Malawi to work on addressing education barriers for children who are considered slow learners in public schools. And today his organization, Rays of Hope, works to improve school attendance and education outcomes for what we call slow learners or disadvantaged learners in Malawi's public schools. So when we met Willie, he had 20 students that were being supported, these slow learners, and he was doing remedial classes for them. Very passionate, had a very big vision, but he didn't really have money to move this vision forward. And everything he was doing was with his own resources. He could barely pay his own salary. So we moved in, gave him grants, and today he's grown this organization to supporting 800 students across 10 schools. And some of the outcomes that they're seeing, they've seen 95% primary school completion rate for learners in their after-school program, and the national rate is only 68%. So it's very clear that, we wouldn't be seeing this level of impact in such a short time if funders hadn't made a decision to invest in a local leader like him. And I think Rays of Hope is one of the ones that I would strongly talk about.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, well let's go into Q&A from the public out there, our viewership, our listenership, whatever the right reference is. Eve, we'll start with a question for you from Dave Rickards. Have you stopped funding any organisations, any community-based organisations, and if so, why? We have. And I would say not very many though, but for the few that we've stopped funding, sometimes it has been that, again, these are started by people that, have achieved something probably in communities. It could be the most successful doctor or the most successful lawyer that, they go back and give back to their communities. But then down the road, of course, they're not getting in enough money. They can't pay their salaries. They can't feed their own families. And at some point they're like, you know what, I really wanted to support my community, but I can no longer do this. They shift their commitment to other things. They have a job to do. They need money to come in. And we find that they will stop investing in the organization as much as they used to. And once that passionate visionary leader is taken out of the picture, then things just start to go downhill. That has been one of the reasons as to why we've stopped funding certain organizations. It is mostly because the leaders just need to survive, but they can't afford to pay their salaries. Okay, Katie, one for you from Wadsi Katsidzira. Funders like Siegel, Planet Wheeler, and now AVF are leading the charge to back local organisations. However, they control a relatively small amount of philanthropic capital. What can larger, less nimble funders do differently to allocate their funding in a way that also builds local organisations and contributes to the desired shift? So what do the large fellows have to do?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and actually one that in many ways we have found in this first year that we are a very attractive option to large, less nimble funders because of those challenges. Skoll Foundation, one of our kind of founding funders, is a great example. They just published their annual letter and a shift in their strategy where they have realized that in order to center equity truly and really make shifts to fund more proximate leaders, both domestically in the US and internationally, as a large bureaucratic funder, they're looking for proximate grant makers and intermediaries. So the African Visionary Fund is a partner of Skoll Foundation for that reason, because we are setting up an institution that can take large grants and then metabolize those into supportive grants and partnerships with many African-led organizations. So of course I would say, if you're a large, nimble funder who's looking to move a lot of money to African-led organizations, I would love to talk to you. There's also great proximate grant makers that aren't the African Visionary Fund that also give to the continent more globally. Thousand Currents is a really incredible intermediary. There's great ones in the US like Groundswell Fund. I think a lot of proximate-led and equity-centered grant makers and intermediaries are going to continue to pop up because these large funders are going to need that kind of bridge to move money that way. So I think that's really going to be the future of giving, is through those types of more proximate intermediaries like the African Visionary Fund and others.
Great, thank you, Katie. Our next question from Mark Domkins to myself. In your experience, what are the major obstacles for Aussie philanthropists, foundations who are on the fence about giving to locally led international projects, for example, in East Africa? Look, number one is the elephant in the room again. We have this thing about trust, but it was sort of outed in our earlier conversation. I've raised an example of a group that we stopped funding due to trust issues. We have stopped funding over 100 organisations over the journey for many, many reasons. Trust is only one of them, and I think Pete Yao referred to the fact that it's 4% of the reasons why groups meet obstacles. Second is knowledge, information about these groups, and that is what we're aiming to fix here with AIDN, with webinars like this. And it's exactly what AVF is seeking to change. You can always look at their website. It's what Partners for Equity and the grassroots portfolio that Eve is managing, aiming to fix that as well. And then the third factor has, of course, been tax deductibility, or if you need DGR1 status. To the extent that one becomes a funder of AVF or through Partners for Equity or other groups like I could think of in Trust or Global Development Group, those barriers can now far more easily be overcome. And to be fair, there's a lot more small NGOs run by Australians active overseas who now have tax deductibility after the changes to the laws a few years ago.
Hey Mark, oh
yes.
Sorry Mark, can I jump in on that as well as like a short reflection on this? I think I may be able to speak on behalf of a few of the funders in the room, but we're also very lean. So I know I'm managing about 18 grantees on my own, right? And I think that might be really reflective of the state of the room, which means that the time that we can spend actually vetting or finding and searching local organizations, just that practicality that's restricted as well as our biasness. Like, even though I grew up in Southeast Asia, my language is very different, you know, like, and that eliminates a lot of French speaking. Let's say if it's East Africa, I think Mark, you were mentioning a lot of Swahili speaking, French speaking, you know, XYZ language speaking, that eliminates just me being proximate or being able to find that. And once again, because of my time resource, I can only find people through referrals and networks. So that stops another significant barrier for finding local led organizations. So that's just a practical also insight there.
Great, thanks Pete. A question from Geneva Loftus. I would love to hear how you've been creative with reporting to shift away from burdensome reporting requirements typical from the larger aid organisations. I'm going to ask Eve on this one, but before Eve answers, I will say we pick up the phone, talk to people. You know what, 45 minutes and you can learn so much over a Zoom call in 45 minutes, or look what you can learn today here in 60 minutes. You can learn an awful lot in a Zoom call that might save someone writing 15 pages. Eve?
Yeah, you said it right. But also for the grassroots portfolio, for example, we don't ask them for many reports. Typically, they'll submit an end of grant report, and it's nothing complicated, very straightforward. The lessons they've learned, the successes, the failures, like things that really give you the insights you need to know to make decisions. Again, because we have regular touch points with them, you know, we have calls with them on a quarterly basis, so we know exactly how the program is going. And there are many groups that send quarterly updates. So if it is an organization that actually is in the habit of sending quarterly updates to all their supporters, then that's all we use. We don't ask them to create other reports in addition to that. Those would be sufficient, and would tell them, you know what, your quarterly reports are good enough for us. Don't create any other reports that you know, are in addition to this. So we just want to keep it for minimal, because we know that report writing can be a job, and it's not an interesting job.
Right. Okay. Look, we've got a few more questions that we haven't been able to get to, and that is thanks to the participation of our audience out there today. So we shall try to address them perhaps in communication we'll send out after this webinar. But look, I'm just going to wrap it up here with thanks to all of our panel here today. I'm sure our listeners right around the world, quite a global audience today for this call, have found this informative, insightful, and a little bit challenging as well. We've been fortunate to hear from 3 individuals who are at the epicenter of this trend and that is changing the shape of international development today. The recording from today will be available on the AIDN website within days. So perhaps Friday night, you can gather the family around the dinner table and listen to it again. You all have Google machines, so feel free to search out any of today's presenters if you wish to follow up the conversation. Failing that, contact Julie Rosenberg via our website. We've got many more webinars planned for this year, and official announcement, we have a podcast series rolling out from April 14th as well. There's also event planning underway, face-to-face meetings, remember those days. The Australian International Development Network is all about more and better international development from Australians. Don't be a stranger, don't be a passenger. If you want to give more, give better, or if you're on the doing side, contact us. We're eager for your assistance, resources, and ideas. So enjoy the rest of your day. Importantly, spend some of your thinking time in these next few weeks analysing the question that we have raised today. What am I doing to support local leaders? Do I only partner with the guy from Sydney? Thank you.